Can you guys see that it's recording?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Um, so for the first question, which items on the code stand out to any of you as most important? I just recently got a chance to go through the entire thing as I was finishing up my 500-word report, and I didn't get so much of a chance to like look at more sections than ours, but I really think that after going back, the most important section to me is the serve your populations section. um, I appreciate how it talks about how things that students say are long lasting, and we don't necessarily know too much about media coverage and the long lasting implications, and any undesirable consequences. So I really like that it addresses all those things because it can be super important, and it can be damaging for students to say something that would last a really long time. So I like that part a lot.
Yeah, I appreciated that one, and then also the fairness and accuracy. I think like it was really important to like go over kind of like how it's stated in both like the survey population and fairness and accuracy to understand like the gravity of like the situations that you may be dealing with, and how students were literally in our teen and early 20 years. And so understanding that things that are said and things that are done and our actions when we're being recorded or being like written down, like with our words and everything, that it's not always a full reflection of like our integrity and our character. So as a reporter, making sure that you're able to decipher like what's like the best way, like without like distorting the image of someone, but also with like staying fair, staying accurate, but also like not damaging the reputation of those when it doesn't need to be damaged. We all make mistakes. We're in our early development years, and so I think it was like pretty important that it put a stress on that, especially with the examples that we talked back in class, especially with that one example. I think it's really important to keep that in mind, um, and keep it as part as like a larger part of the ethics.
I agree. And in addition to what you're saying, I think not only in the collegiate journalistic code of ethics, I think it ties into the SPJ code of ethics, talking about minimizing harm and also the concept of the golden rule. It states that we're all people. Not only are we all people, but we're all college students. So we're going through a lot of the same things. So if you're interviewing someone, you need to remember, how would I want to look in that report? And then report not only as a source, but as a person in general. And then you can minimize harm from there by remembering how you want to come across and have that person come across in that type of way.
Yeah, actually, kind of to tie with that, but then also move to like recommendations and stuff. I kind of mentioned how I would like to see a specific category of like accountability, because as you guys mentioned, like obviously that's a huge part of the code, and there's it's kind of tied into the different sections as well. But I think clearly outlining a specific section of accountability will just show to journalists how important it is that they're representing kind of all of the media, and one person kind of not acknowledging that they are accountable to what they're saying and they have to attribute that to themselves, will just show that they don't it'll be more difficult to criticize the media if they accept accountability and they kind of take this and that's how they write their story. So I think that would be a great addition. And obviously the code is a great starting point, but I think it can always be kind of fixed up and added to.
Yeah, I actually literally had the same kind of comment when I was going through it, not to add a separate section for accountability necessarily, but I thought that for our section, professionalism and transparency, it was a lot of repetitive bullets about conflicts of interest and bias,
Right.
but I wanted there to be more emphasis on the transparency and making sure that readers understand where the information is coming from, and you're getting the information in a fair way. So kind of I had the same suggestion that there needs to be more of the accountability aspect and more transparency, and it wasn't so much emphasized to my liking. It was more repetitive. I thought actually a lot of this seemed to be repetitive to me.
Yeah, I agree. I like said in my suggestions like too that I think like at least like 3 or 4 of them could be consolidated into like one, just because while it's like nice that there are rules about like conflicts of interest, like I think it's more important to be like upfront about like you said, like the information and like where reporters are like getting the sources rather than like their own personal like conflicts. Like I don't think that's as important as the code kind of makes it out to be as is.
I think, and I mentioned this as well, that there should be not just accountability, but a section on sources, because I feel like a lot of journalists get tied up in how to source, who to source, and a lot of it was mentioned in professionalism and transparency, especially number 8 about friends and coworkers. But I also think, especially after the story that got retracted from the Lantern, number 1, I believe there should be a line added about how to paraphrase and how to quote a story without changing it to fit your story. I think it should be emphasized about that. But also, she talked about how she kept the emails, and then the emails then can prove or disprove the situation that was going on. So I think it's important that we keep our contacts and our sources and emails. In addition to, I think it's helpful to record our interviews if it's in person as well. But with that comes a lot of responsibility, because you need to make sure that you have consent on both ends. And I think that needs to be included as well, because even though that's a law, I think it's important that it's reiterated, because a lot of this legally we don't want to get in trouble for. And I think there's a lot of, like you guys said, it talks about a lot of the same things over and over again. So I feel like if we consolidated that and then added a new section for sources, we could rearrange it and add it in there as well. Because I think sourcing is a very important aspect to journalism.
Yeah, I agree. And like going off of your point, talking about how you need consent from like both people, in my interview, she was talking about how sometimes you can get carried away with talking to someone like at a restaurant or a bar or even like a conference and forget to mention you're a reporter or a journalist. And then you might want to use something that they said, but that's kind of where the whole ethical thing comes into play, because then you have to go back and make sure that they're okay with using whatever they said in their report. And I feel like that would be kind of like hard to do and almost like sometimes in an awkward position, because like my girl said, like by you telling them that you're a journalist, like they are trusting you, and so you want them to be able, and you need to trust them too, so that they can give you the correct information.
Just really quickly going back to sources specifically, the one point of confusion that I did note when I was looking at things that we were going to be discussing today, I was confused reading the section about diversify voices, number 6, conduct a source audit at least once a semester to understand the bias that may creep into your reporting through sources. That sounds like it would be really important, but I don't know what a source, as someone that's not a journalist or a reporter, I don't know what conduct a source audit means.
Yeah, I don't either.
I can, I'm kind of like assuming what it is. And like Nicole, you can definitely, like, speaking out to Nicole Kraft here, you can definitely challenge me on this, but I'm pretty sure it means like kind of going through the sources that maybe you regularly go to, like for stories that your reporters do, or kind of like looking at to make sure that you're not having any conflict of interest with those sources, objectivity and bias issues, kind of just like making sure. So I talked to Bella, the editor-in-chief of the Lantern, and one thing that we talked about for my criteria was number 4, like about conflict of interest and like how to stay objective. And she said they like as a reporter you have a responsibility, but also they have an editorial staff where one of like the jobs of the editorial staff is to kind of look at your sources and like look at your story and make sure like everything is balanced. So like that your story has multiple perspectives, or that your sources are unbiased, or like your sourcing itself is balanced and everything. So I think like making sure like that kind of like that criterion right there, I think it was number 6 you said, Millie. I think that one's all about just like taking a step back from like looking at like all like the stories that you've done and all the sources that you've gone through, because the majority of the time when you're a reporter you kind of report about the same things, or similar topics, and so making sure that they are fresh, they're updated, and that you're kind of not just like going back to like old habits and old sources each time, because yes, intelligence and like knowledge is powerful, but you also fresh perspective is going to be something that is what keeps journalism and reporting alive.
And to tag off of that as well, I interviewed Jacob Bench, and he's the sports editor, and he was mentioning that he was a TA for some of the guys on the basketball team. And so it's easier for him to go to them and source people that he's TA'd rather than go to someone he's never met and ask them for an interview. So he said sometimes it's a little more difficult for him to report from an outside perspective using other sources versus the ones he's TA'd, because even though they're not quote unquote friends, they do have a relationship there that's further than a stranger or someone that just joined the team he's never met.
Yeah, kind of to go into that more, I kind of hit conflict of interest with my interview. I interviewed Spencer Hunt, and he kind of hit the point of there's going to be times where conflict of interest arises. He said that kind of the way he viewed this rule and how he like the policy, the way he had it in his head was don't cover topics that will personally benefit you. And so there's a difference between using your sources and kind of leveraging that and to people who you know and are able to reach out to versus like reporting on a story that those are your friends and you're reporting it one way because of them. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I never really thought of it like that. But obviously that's like a clearer way to look at conflict of interest.
Yeah, I also interviewed Spencer Hunt, and I had criteria number 3, which was one of the ones that I felt could have been roped in a little bit with conflict of interest, even though mine wasn't one that explicitly mentioned it. So I did try to steer him away. He wanted to give me conflict of interest responses and examples because that's kind of what mine sounds like, aka maintaining your objectivity is what mine was about. But the one thing that he did share with me, which I thought was really interesting and definitely a perspective that was completely new to me, was it wasn't so much about his students, but he talked about when he was a reporter himself, he covered an execution after a death penalty case. And he had, I mean, you expect what's going to happen a little bit when you're going into covering an execution, but you probably can never assume what is actually going to be in front of you and how you will emotionally respond to it. So he went into it and watched the execution and then reported on it. And he said he did a really good job, I'm sure. And they asked him to do another one afterwards, but he had to tell his boss and editor and team that he just simply didn't, he knew that his emotions from the first one would make him biased in reporting the second one. He didn't think he could emotionally cover it objectively. So instead of, I mean, yes, 100% looking out for conflicts of interest all the time, but I appreciated that perspective that he shared with me about you need to gauge your own emotions on certain topics and understand when to take a step back.
Yeah, I kind of I talked with Mike Thompson, who's the WOSU news director, and we kind of talked about like whether or not like it's important to reveal like to like the audience and like the readers like your own like personal conflicts of interest. And we kind of talked about like how like there's a difference between like a conflict of interest that like is like personal to you and like you kind of shouldn't read the story because it would affect the writing, and a conflict of interest like where you just have like a prior knowledge of something. And the he like explained that he doesn't believe that like the readers are entitled to know everything, and that kind of like you have to gauge like when it's important to like disclose that. And sometimes like they don't always have to know like your own personal conflicts of interest, and if it's a conflict of interest that like would affect the piece in a general sense, then like you shouldn't be writing it anyways. Like you should pass it on to someone else or like ask an advisor to like overlook it or do it instead, just because there's like a line that you have to walk. and just decide between the two.
Yeah. Kind of just like one like point of confusion that I had, or like we're kind of like two of them, I would say, is so number 8 in our section of professionalism transparency, it talks about cohesive staff and like diversity of voices. So I like wondered like what your guys' thoughts and opinions were on like, do you think like that one should have honestly been in diversify voices, or like on like how like it should be like moved down a little bit, because I feel like it's not so much about transparency and professionalism, and like I can see how it can be attached to professionalism, but overall it talks about diversity strengthens journalism. And so I just like wanted to gauge like your guys' thoughts, because like I that was like a point of like questioning or like confusing like why you would think it would be mainly in the professionalism and transparency section. Like why did you guys like think like, or do you guys think that it should stay in the section or move?
So I'm very conflicted on that because that was my criterion that I chose. So I put a lot of thought into it, and I 100% agree that it should go under the diversity section. But I also believe that it should be split up into two like topics itself, because once in the very beginning it talks about a cohesive staff and friends and coworkers, and then it goes straight into diversity and encouraging new people. So I feel like if you're encouraging new people to join the newspaper and trying to diversify your circle or your friend group, then they aren't your friends possibly, and that just is a broad subject. Like you could be inviting strangers in. Like Jacob says that every chance he gets, even if he knows the person or not, he's encouraging people to join his staff or to join the newspaper, or even he encouraged me to join the radio broadcasting um, source that we have here, Scarlet and Gray Broadcasting. So he said even if it's not just the newspaper, he's encouraging that because it reflects on the university. And so I think that the reason it's under professionalism and transparency is it leans towards the transparency part a little more, considering that it is talking about our friends and our staff. And we have to remember that we can't gear our project or article that we're writing on to make us look good in front of our friends and our staff, because those are going to be our editors as well as the person publishing it. So we don't want to gear it towards them just so they publish our article. But I also think that the second part should go under diversity, as well as really each section. It just depends on how you word it. So that's why I was a little confused. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought if you just added or took away a few words, it really could go under each section. But I think the reason it's under that top one is because of the transparency part, because you want to be completely transparent and totally unbiased on your sources and what you're writing and the reason you're writing for. But I agree that it should be split up, and I think that it should be moved.
Yeah, so this was actually one of the ones I had beef with. It was this number 8 under professionalism and transparency, and then number 1 under fairness and accuracy. These both to me were, the first one obviously is wordy, and definitely you can see literally halfway through it changes course to diversity, pretty clear cut halfway through. And then I thought this number 1 from fairness and accuracy was of the same essence. You're reading it, and yes, dignity and respect are vital to reporting fairly. If you're not trusted or respected, your work will reflect that. And then it switches to be collaborative, serve the people who compromise your college community, which those are both super important, but they don't, to me, belong in the same sentence. So those were both ones that I felt could be split up and maybe moved around section wise.
Yeah. Do you guys have like anyone else like have any want to talk about like their suggestions or anything that we did? I know for mine, I think like I think we all had like beef with our section just because we thought it was like very repetitive. I was scrolling through like our recommendations, and I could see a lot of us were saying like split up these two or add these two together or delete these 3 because they're literally a repeat of like this one. I know I felt that way, especially for number 3 and number 4 of the criterion, and I felt like they kind of discussed conflict of interest and objectivity kind of like a lot. And I know we talked about transparency and adding that more in, but what else are your guys' thoughts on the recommendations that you guys had or your narratives in general?
So mine wasn't about conflict of interest at all. So it was like completely different than everyone else's in this thing. So mine is about like press releases and how not using is more effective. And I talked to Whitney Harding, who is a broadcast journalist for the NBC, like sports mainly. And she told me that basically she never asks for an email or written statement because she can tell that the emotion and passion behind people's voices is a part of the story and how that's important. I didn't even think about that before I started talking to her. But then I wanted to add in the thing about how this is completely different than what I was just talking about, but how we should all come up with a definition of what fairness really means to us. Because
Did anyone else, was that
yeah,
choppy for
the
everyone?
definition is changing a lot, and she basically said there's no like real definition to what fair is, and fair is to us and how we're going to do our jobs correctly. Is it my internet connection?
It was, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I didn't know if you were frozen for a second.
No,
but
I was finished, but it just told me in the middle of me talking that my internet connection was unstable. No.
Oh, you were good. It was a little choppy at first, but I think we got everything.
Okay, that's fine.
I
Yeah, I'm
think
done.
adding that fairness part and portion will be very pertinent and like helpful. And like overall, like the code of ethics itself, like just like looking at it, I think it's like a good representation of like what we should be looking for as like student journalists. And I think it hits on like some very important pieces, such as the fairness and accuracy and making sure that you're serving the population. I think that's something that as college students, we get really excited about, kind of because we are in like our selfish years of life. And so like kind of like serving ourselves when we're doing a lot of like our assignments, because it's a time where we can express ourselves. But how can we use like our individual talents to really just like serve the population is something that I really appreciated about the code of ethics and how it emphasized.
Yeah, I thought it like hit everything, if not more than once. So it did a really good job covering things that I wouldn't have even thought of.
Definitely.
we've
I like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I think we've talked a lot about how repetitive the code of ethics is. And I think that also kind of goes towards the SPJ code of ethics as well. But then I started to think if we didn't have such detail and if they weren't repeating themselves, then maybe it wouldn't get across to us
Right.
in detail. Because even though one aspect could fit under each and every single one of the topics, we need to look at it from that topic's perspective, because we need to diversify in order to be transparent. And then we need to diversify to have a wide range of people and sources. So that fits under diversity. And then it could go to fairness and accuracy as well. But we need to look at it from each point of view. So I think that including each detail and hitting that point several times in a different way, even though it seems repetitive to us and maybe even a little annoying having to read it several times, I think if it wasn't there, then it could be a liability or a miscommunication. Because if it's miscommunicated and a journalist that's brand new and may have no journalism background, they refer to it and they say, well, it wasn't there. And then that leaves room for mistake. And I think that that's why it reiterates everything several times, because this isn't the SPJ code of ethics where these journalists have a lot of experience and have been through college possibly. This is for students that are still learning. So even though I agree that there could be a lot that could be reduced or taken away or combined, I think that there is a reason for it being there. And I think that that helps us cover and source and look at our relationships as journalists, specifically on Ohio State's campus.
Yeah, and I think that just when they do reiterate like that, I think it's kind of just expressing how important those points are. And I think also the ones that are repetitive are things that are very important, like as journalists. So you want to learn that young so that when you do get into the real world and do this for a possible career, you know, you already have a good base and can just go from there.
Yeah, I don't want to cut a new one off, but I do think we're over the time now. So,
Okay.
yeah, that was good chat, guys. I'm gonna end the recording now.
Okay.